Your Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege and honor to join you here this morning and to address you both on behalf of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who regrets not having been able to join this World Government Summit as he did last year and has requested me to represent him here, and also to address you in my capacity as the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme that every day across the world is asking itself precisely this question: what is the government of the future going to look like? What is it that governments and public policy have to deliver to enable our economies and societies to thrive? Let me begin by referring to a journey that I made just a few weeks ago that took me from one extreme of the outlook on the future of government and the economy to another extreme. It was a journey from Davos in Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, that within 24 hours then took me to Ethiopia and a visit to Godi and the Somali region of Ethiopia, where an extraordinary drought, persistent drought, has led to catastrophic impacts on communities, on pastoral communities and the local economy. To me, it was a very striking journey because in Davos we were talking about the future of our economies and societies in terms of hyperlatives, technology, the trillion-dollar economy, the billion-dollar companies, the markets of tomorrow, connectivity without precedent. It was an outlook of almost unlimited opportunity. 24 hours later, I was in a camp with internally displaced pastoralist communities who essentially had concluded that their lifestyle was no longer viable. After years of having experienced the catastrophic impact of drought, of losing all their livestock, they were acknowledging the simple fact that theirs was not a future that they could anymore pursue, and therefore had to look for an entirely different lifestyle. I mention this because this is the reality of the spectrum when we talk about governments of the future and when we also talk about technology and innovation. The remarkable thing in Ethiopia is that this drought is worse than any drought in recent memory, even worse than the drought that brought those terrible images of famine well over 2.5 decades ago to all of us. Part of that is the result of government having put disaster risk management strategies in place, the international community rising to the challenge, and through the call of also our Secretary General at the beginning of last year, alerting the world to the extraordinary risks of not responding to the challenge of drought, multi-year drought, and therefore mobilizing that effort that we call humanitarian support and aid, for which also Dubai is so well known and respected because it forms a part of this international response capacity that in this case averted famine. People are suffering, but government, the international community, through providing timely food aid and emergency support, was able to avert the kind of disaster that we have so often seen. By drawing this contrast, I want to focus on a simple fact that I personally believe that technology and innovation are as relevant to what will happen next in Ethiopia as it is to those who are charting out business strategies and markets and also governance policies for the future of that trillion-dollar economy in which technology in all its facets and forms will change the way that we look at the future of our societies and economies. But when we discuss governments of the future, one might be tempted sometimes when you are at a meeting such as this, or also in Davos or other places where technology and particularly the entrepreneurial vision dominates the discussion, to think that governments are becoming increasingly redundant or at least marginal or less central to what happens next. It would be my contention today that indeed there are times and places where governments stand in the way of innovation and where public policy both hinders public policy legislation and also progress in our economy. It gets in the way of innovation, it prevents entrepreneurs from being able to invest, and therefore is in a sense a liability. But my main proposition this morning is that actually, because of the extraordinary changes that we will witness over the coming decades, driven significantly in this century by technology frontiers and innovation, we may find governments, and perhaps more importantly governance, as also Prime Minister Modi yesterday emphasized, of critical importance. Part of that has to do with the fact that the digital age in which we now live, automation, artificial intelligence, connectivity, the Internet of Things, and everything else that we are discussing in many of the halls here, will profoundly change lives, whether you're living in the Somali region of Ethiopia, whether you're an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, or you're thinking about the future markets for technology in Shenzhen. The question is, how are we to understand this intelligent, smart public policy making that will allow innovation to succeed while addressing a fundamental fact, that just because you can do something and just because you can sell it in the marketplace, it does not automatically produce greater happiness. And I here want to echo also the decision that you have taken to establish a public policy function specifically around concepts of happiness and tolerance. I believe that this is no accident, it is no coincidence, that at this critical moment in time, where some would say that technology, the digital economy, make these kinds of romantic terms of the past redundant. Well, the opposite is true. And I think here in Dubai, as we have seen in Bhutan and in many parts across the world, there is a clear recognition that in deploying technology, we must ensure that it is not only driven by the possibility of technology, but also by what governments are meant to ensure. And that is a social compact. Why do we elect governments? We could run our societies individually, but we know we cannot. We need governments to transact on behalf of all of us outcomes that are fair, that are inclusive, that are sustainable, and we could use many other qualitative terms to describe this. At the heart of this is the ability of societies to govern themselves in a way that ensures that societies deliver what people seek, which is happiness, fulfillment, the ability to educate your children, to have a health system that supports you, and many other aspects. And yes, these are often and frequently built on the foundations of economic policy, but they are usually defined, and nations that are most successful in the long term are those that recognize that economics may be a foundation, it is not the destination in itself. And this is what is central in understanding the role of government and of governance in the future. If we look at the possibilities, and I think all of you who are here will have seen just in the last 2 days the extraordinary possibilities that are now opening before our very eyes. Artificial intelligence will change everything in terms of capacity, thresholds, possibilities. But as we have also seen, living in the digital age creates interesting challenges. When the marginal cost of adding another 1 million consumers to a particular platform or an algorithm that you have developed is virtually zero, we may end up in a world where 10 companies control virtually all the information that circulates in our economy. We know that this is not a desirable outcome. We also know that it is a great privilege to have connectivity in many of the capitals of the world. But much of the world's population, in fact, close to half of our 3.5 billion citizens, and soon in a population of 10 billion, it will still be 4 or 5 billion, will live in rural economies. So can we ensure that fiber optic cables not only supply that connectivity to where it pays from a commercial point of view, but connects the rural economies where people will have to earn their livelihoods if they are not to become internally displaced people in masses having to flee to the cities? How governments can govern both the economic regulatory space, how they can ensure inclusiveness, and how they can also, in times of great ecological stress, ensure that technologies contribute to solving problems rather than amplify the challenges of sustainability, will be central. One of the most rapidly evolving aspects in practice is e-government and e-governance. Clearly here, the benefits are self-evident. Governments become more transparent. Digital platforms, apps, and the connectivity of citizens in terms of one-stop shops are now things that we see springing up all over the world. And I think we have no question here that clearly technology and innovation is making government better. But that is how governments function. And we have learned many lessons, and in UNDP, indeed, we work in dozens of countries in helping, both at the federal and at the subnational level, governments develop the kinds of platforms that allow citizens greater participation. It gets more complicated when it comes to shaping markets. and licensing, so to speak, businesses and enterprises, particularly in those economies that have to make concessions in order to attract investments in the first place. How much do you make an economy simply the subject of global market forces as opposed to national development objectives, culture, identity? How do you ensure that those who are not necessarily in the front line of using technology will actually be empowered as a result of being able to access these innovations? The last few years have taught us bitter lessons about what happens in our societies when too many people are left behind, when too many feel marginalized, excluded, see in a sense, because access to information is now ubiquitous all over the world, the extraordinary privileges of having access to technology and innovation, but themselves feeling left behind, left out, and therefore prone to question both their society and, more corrosively, their governments and the authority of government. It is that moment when the notion of social compact and normative issues becomes very central in defining the relationship between government and technology and innovation. I end by just making a reference to an attempt by the international community to capture this particular issue when in the year 2015 it adopted the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. These Sustainable Development Goals are universal. They speak to every nation, every country, and they reflect a very profound recognition that in the last 30 to 50 years, we have often prioritized economic growth. We believe that GDP indicators would define also an overall level of well-being in society. Well, we have been reminded across the world in the last 10 years what a big mistake that is if you do not recognize that society, inequality, equity, but also sustainability, the promise of the current generation to the next generation, are not honored. And in that sense, the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework within which also the role of government in the future, in both enabling technology and markets and services, but also in governing the economy that is driven by technology, can be shaped in a way that can deliver tolerant, happy, successful societies. Our work in the United Nations system every day is to learn from governments, to learn about the possibilities of technology, and to connect this world in terms of best practice. I do not have the time this morning to speak to some of those lessons, but let me tell you, it is an extraordinarily exciting time. In UNDP, where we are active in 170 countries, we are seeing a level of innovation in government and governance that is without precedent. We are establishing SDG innovation labs. We are seeing the deployment of technology in ways that was unimaginable, whether it is drones or whether it is perhaps in just a few years' time, Google Street View replacing household surveys, because in fact, with algorithms and AI, a Google Street View can give us more accurate information about where the poor live, how we can leave no one behind in the rapid development of economic infrastructure, and therefore achieve development outcomes that are commensurate with the very high aspirations that our societies have and should have at the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you very much.